Sometimes a man loses so much that he forgets what it feels like to care about anything. Sometimes the wounds run so deep that the only way to survive is to disappear into the mountains and never look back. Mountain man Obadiah Crane had lived alone in the Colorado wilderness for 15 years. He traded with distant settlements only when he needed supplies. He spoke to people only when he had to. His cabin sat high in the pine forests, where no one could find him. The world below had taken everything from him once, and he would never let it happen again. But on a cold morning when the first snows began to fall, Obadiah found a dying father and his 2 starving daughters collapsed near an abandoned homestead. What happened next would change everything he thought he knew about family, revenge, and the power of blood ties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hand-carved wooden cross stood weathered and grey against the morning sky, its simple lines marking the spot where Obadiah Crane had buried his heart 15 years ago. He visited the grave every Sunday without fail, carrying fresh pine boughs to lay beneath the modest marker. Today, like every other day for the past decade and a half, he stood in silence before the cross that bore no names, only a date carved deep into the wood. September 15th, 1859. The grave held his wife Margaret and their 7-year-old daughter Ruth, taken from him not by disease or accident, but by the calculated greed of men who saw families as obstacles to profit. The Denver and Pacific Railroad had wanted their fertile valley land, and when Obadiah refused to sell, they found other ways to persuade him. Ways that involved hired guns, mysterious fires, and accidents that weren't accidents at all. Margaret had been visiting her sister in town when the gunmen came. They told her that her husband had been killed in a hunting mishap, that she needed to sign papers immediately to settle his affairs. In her grief and confusion, she signed away their land for a fraction of its worth. When she discovered the deception, she tried to fight back through the territorial courts. That's when the real accidents began. A runaway wagon, a spooked horse, a simple fall downstairs that shouldn't have been fatal but somehow was. By the time Obadiah returned from his extended hunting trip to find his family dead and his land stolen, the railroad men had covered their tracks well. The local sheriff, Judge Morrison, and half the town council were in their pockets. Justice was a luxury that poor farmers couldn't afford. Obadiah had tried fighting through proper channels at first. He'd hired what lawyers he could afford, filed appeals, even traveled to Denver to petition the territorial government. But the railroad's influence reached far beyond their small valley. Every door he approached was already locked from the inside. Every official he met had already been bought or intimidated into compliance. That's when the old soldier in him began to surface. Obadiah had served with distinction in the Mexican War, earning recognition for his tactical brilliance and fierce protective instincts when it came to his men. Those same instincts now turned toward vengeance, and for 6 months he waged a private war against the railroad and everyone who had helped them steal his life. He was methodical and patient, striking at their operations with the precision of a military campaign. Supply trains derailed in remote mountain passes. Survey crews found their equipment mysteriously destroyed. Company officials discovered that riding alone through certain mountain trails could be hazardous to their health. The territorial government eventually sent federal marshals to investigate, but by then Obadiah had already vanished into the high country, leaving behind only a reputation and a carefully buried cache of railroad gold that he'd liberated during his campaign. The cabin he'd built sat at nearly 8,000 feet, nestled in a grove of towering pines that concealed it from casual observation. He'd chosen the location carefully high enough to discourage most visitors, but with clear sightlines down 3 different mountain passes. A natural spring provided fresh water year-round, and the surrounding forest offered abundant game and wild edibles for a man who knew how to live off the land. The structure itself reflected 15 years of careful craftsmanship and practical engineering. Built from hand-hewn logs, chinked with mountain clay and moss, it featured thick walls designed to retain heat during brutal Colorado winters. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney designed to disperse smoke in a way that wouldn't betray the cabin's location to observers in the valleys below. Windows were small but strategically placed to provide maximum defensive observation while minimizing heat loss. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished, but comfortable in its simplicity. A sturdy table and chairs occupied the center of the main room, while shelves lined the walls holding books, supplies, and the various tools needed for mountain survival. His sleeping area was partitioned off by heavy curtains, and a smaller room served as both pantry and workshop. Every item had its place, and everything was maintained with military precision. Obadiah's daily routine had become as predictable as the mountain weather patterns. He rose before dawn, tended to his small garden and the snares that provided fresh meat, then spent his mornings maintaining the cabin and its surroundings. Afternoons were devoted to hunting, fishing, or gathering the wild plants and herbs that supplemented his diet. Evenings found him reading by firelight. He'd managed to accumulate a respectable library over the years, trading furs and handcrafted items for books whenever he visited the distant settlements. His contact with civilization was minimal and carefully controlled. 3 times a year, he would make the day-long journey down to Clearwater Falls, a small settlement that served as a trading post for trappers and miners. He traded furs, handmade tools, and occasionally gold dust for supplies he couldn't produce himself: coffee, sugar, ammunition, and books. The townspeople knew him only as a quiet mountain man who paid in cash and asked no questions. He encouraged no friendships and shared no personal information. The isolation had been necessary for survival at first, but over the years it had become something else, a protective barrier against the kind of pain that came from caring about people. Obadiah had learned that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, that emotional connections were vulnerabilities his enemies could exploit. Better to live alone than to risk losing everything again. But solitude came with its own costs. The silence of the mountains could be profound, especially during the long winter months when snow blocked the passes and even the wildlife seemed to disappear. There were nights when the wind howling through the pines sounded almost like voices calling his name, reminders of conversations he'd never have again. The cabin walls that protected him from the elements couldn't shield him from memories, and sometimes the weight of his isolation felt heavier than the mountain's snow. This particular morning felt different somehow, though Obadiah couldn't say exactly why. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. He'd learned to trust such feelings over the years. The wilderness had its own way of warning those who knew how to listen. As he made his way back from the gravesite, something caught his eye in the valley below. Smoke was rising from the old Hendricks place, a homestead that had been abandoned for nearly 2 years. Obadiah knew the property well. It sat at the junction of 2 mountain streams, with good soil and natural shelter from the worst winter winds. The previous owners had given up after a series of crop failures and moved back east, leaving behind a cabin that was gradually being reclaimed by the forest. Through his field glasses, Obadiah could see that the smoke was thin and irregular, not the steady stream that would indicate a well-tended fire. Something was wrong down there. His instincts, honed by years of military service and mountain survival, were screaming warnings that he couldn't ignore. For a long moment, he stood at the edge of his clearing, torn between curiosity and caution. His first impulse was to mind his own business. Whatever was happening down there was none of his concern, but the irregular nature of the smoke suggested someone in distress, possibly injured or in need of help. Despite his self-imposed isolation, Obadiah had never been able to completely silence the voice of conscience that his father had instilled in him as a boy. The descent to the abandoned homestead took him nearly an hour, following game trails and natural cover that would keep him concealed until he could assess the situation. As he drew closer, the details became clearer and more troubling. The cabin's door hung open, and what he'd taken for smoke was actually steam rising from wet clothes hung haphazardly on a makeshift line. Someone had been trying to dry out soaked garments, but the fire had clearly gone out. That's when he heard the crying, not the robust wails of healthy children, but the weak, desperate sounds of youngsters pushed beyond their limits. Caution warred with compassion as Obadiah crept closer, every sense alert for signs of danger. What he saw when he finally reached the cabin's broken porch rail would haunt him for the rest of his life. A man lay collapsed just outside the doorway, his clothes soaked through and his face pale with fever or exhaustion. Two small girls, probably 8 or 9 years old and clearly twins, huddled beside him with the desperate intensity of children who understood that their father was dying. They were thin to the point of starvation, their clothes little more than rags, and their eyes held the hollow look of youngsters who had seen too much hardship too early. The girls noticed him first, their heads snapping up with the alertness of wild animals sensing a predator. For a moment, nobody moved. Obadiah stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers. The children stared at him with expressions that mixed hope and terror in equal measure, hope that this stranger might be able to help their father, terror that he might represent a new and different kind of threat. The man on the ground stirred weakly, his eyes opening just enough to register Obadiah's presence. When he tried to speak, only a hoarse whisper emerged. "Please the girls, they haven't eaten in days." Every instinct Obadiah had developed over 15 years of careful isolation screamed at him to turn around and walk away. These people represented exactly the kind of complication he'd spent half his life avoiding. Helping them would mean bringing strangers into his carefully ordered world, exposing himself to the kind of emotional involvement that had once destroyed him. But looking at those hollow-eyed children, he found that some impulses ran deeper than self-preservation. "Can you walk?" he asked the man, his voice rough from disuse. The stranger tried to push himself up, but collapsed back against the cabin wall. "Don't think so. Been sick for days. The girls, they tried to take care of me, but there's no food left." Obadiah looked at the twins again, noting the intelligence in their eyes, despite their obvious distress. They were old enough to understand that their situation was desperate, but young enough to still believe that adults could fix things that seemed impossible. That faith in their hollow gazes was what finally broke through his defenses. "I have food," he said simply, "and medicine. Can you girls help your father walk if I support him on the other side?" The response was immediate and heartbreaking. Both children nodded eagerly, scrambling to their feet with renewed energy at the prospect of help. They positioned themselves on either side of their father with the practiced efficiency of youngsters who had been functioning as caregivers far too long. Getting the sick man up the mountain to his cabin was going to be one of the most challenging things Obadiah had done in years, not physically, but emotionally. Every step would be taking him further from the safety of solitude and deeper into the dangerous territory of human connection. But as he looked at those two brave little girls preparing to help carry their father to safety, he realized that some bridges, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The journey back to his cabin would take most of the day, and by the time they reached the safety of his hidden clearing, Obadiah Crane would no longer be the same man who had descended the mountain that morning. Sometimes fate had a way of finding people, even when they thought they'd hidden themselves beyond its reach. The railroad survey map crinkled between Vernon Whitfield's trembling fingers as he tried to smooth it out on Obadiah's rough-hewn table. The parchment was water-stained and torn at the edges, but the bold red lines marking planned routes through what had once been family homesteads were still clearly visible. Vernon had kept it hidden in his coat pocket through weeks of running, a piece of evidence that proved what the railroad companies would never admit in public. The journey up the mountain had taken 6 grueling hours, with the twins, Patience and Charity, taking turns helping support their father's weight. By the time they reached Obadiah's cabin, Vernon was barely conscious, his fever spiking dangerously high. The girls had maintained their brave front throughout the climb, but once safely inside the warm cabin, exhaustion and relief finally overwhelmed them. Obadiah found himself moving through routines he hadn't performed in 15 years. He built up the fire, heated water for washing, and prepared a simple but nourishing broth from dried venison and mountain herbs. The domestic activities felt strange after so many years of caring only for himself, but his hands remembered the motions from a life he'd tried to forget. While the broth simmered, he examined Vernon more carefully. The man was in his early 40s, with the weathered hands of a farmer and the lean build of someone who'd missed too many meals. His fever was high but not life-threatening, and aside from exhaustion and malnutrition, he seemed fundamentally sound. What worried Obadiah more were the old scars on Vernon's hands and forearms, the kind of marks left by rope burns and barbed wire, suggesting a man who'd fought hard against forces beyond his control. The twins sat huddled together on the bench near the fireplace, their eyes wide as they took in their surroundings. They were perhaps 8 years old, though malnutrition made it difficult to be certain. Despite their identical features, their personalities were already distinct. Patience, the slightly taller of the two, watched everything with alert intelligence, cataloging details and assessing potential dangers with the wariness of a child who'd learned not to trust easily. Charity seemed more sensitive, her artistic nature evident in the way she studied the carved details on Obadiah's furniture and the careful arrangement of books on his shelves. "Your father needs rest," Obadiah told them as he ladled broth into wooden bowls. "But he's going to be fine. Are you girls hungry?" The question was unnecessary. Their hollow cheeks and the desperate way they clutched the warm bowls answered him clearly enough. They ate slowly, with the careful control of children who'd learned that food was precious and not to be wasted. Between spoonfuls, they stole glances at their host, trying to reconcile his gruff appearance with his gentle actions. Vernon drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the first day, mumbling fragments of stories that gradually painted a picture of systematic persecution. He spoke of midnight visits from railroad enforcers, crops mysteriously poisoned, and legal documents that disappeared from courthouse files. In his fevered state, he called out names that made Obadiah's blood run cold: Judge Morrison, Sheriff Caldwell, and Railroad Commissioner Blackthorne, the same men who had orchestrated the destruction of his own family. On the second morning, Vernon's fever broke, and he was finally able to speak coherently. The story he told, in broken sentences punctuated by exhaustion, was hauntingly familiar to Obadiah. The Denver and Pacific Railroad had wanted the Whitfield family's land for a new spur line that would connect the mining camps in the eastern mountains to the main rail network. When Vernon refused to sell, the pressure campaign began. "They started small," Vernon explained, his voice barely above a whisper, "offers that got bigger every month. When that didn't work, they sent lawyers with papers claiming we owed taxes we'd already paid. Then the accidents started happening. Vernon's wife, Sarah, had been killed in what the sheriff called a riding accident, though Vernon knew she'd been an expert horsewoman since childhood. Their older son had simply vanished while checking trap lines, leaving no trace despite extensive searching. The message was clear: keep refusing to sell, and the rest of the family would follow. "I signed the papers," Vernon said, shame evident in his voice. "After Sarah died, after Tommy disappeared, I couldn't risk losing the girls too, but they cheated me anyway, paid me a quarter of what the land was worth, and even that in railroad script instead of real money. By the time I realized what they'd done, we were already homeless." The twins listened to their father's story with the stoic acceptance of children who'd lived through tragedy beyond their years. Patience reached over to squeeze her father's hand, while Charity quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Their resilience impressed Obadiah, reminding him of qualities he'd once admired in his own daughter. "Where were you headed?" Obadiah asked. "West. Toward California. Sarah had a sister in Sacramento who said we could start over there, but I got sick in the mountains and our supplies ran out. If you hadn't found us." Vernon's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. As Vernon regained strength over the next few days, he shared more details about the railroad's operations. The survey map he carried showed planned routes through dozens of family properties, each marked with acquisition dates and status notes. Some properties were marked as acquired, usually following mysterious accidents or financial ruin. Others were listed as pending families still fighting the inevitable. "They call it progress," Vernon said bitterly, "opening up the frontier for commerce and civilization. But what they really mean is stealing land from families who've worked it for generations and handing it over to Eastern investors who've never seen a mountain." Obadiah studied the map with growing anger and recognition. The pattern was exactly the same as what had happened to his own family 15 years earlier, just on a larger scale. The railroad companies had refined their methods, making the process more efficient and profitable. They'd learned that it was cheaper to destroy a few families than to pay fair market value for the land they needed. The twins began to settle into the cabin's routines with surprising ease. Patience proved to be naturally helpful, assisting with cooking and cleaning, without being asked. Charity showed artistic talent, sketching pictures with charcoal on scraps of paper and arranging wildflowers in ways that brought unexpected beauty to the austere cabin. Their presence gradually transformed the space from a hermit's refuge into something resembling a home, but it was the way they looked at Obadiah that disturbed him most. There was something in their eyes, a flicker of recognition or familiarity that he couldn't explain. Several times he caught them whispering together, glancing in his direction with expressions that suggested they were trying to solve a puzzle. When he asked them about it directly, they just smiled and claimed they were talking about girl things that wouldn't interest him. Vernon noticed it too. "They've been acting strange since we got here," he admitted during one of their evening conversations. "Patience keeps asking me questions about Sarah's family, things she never seemed interested in before. And Charity's been drawing pictures of mountains and cabins, like she's trying to remember something." The most unsettling moment came on their fourth night in the cabin. Obadiah was reading by the fire, while the family prepared for sleep, when Charity approached him with one of her drawings. It showed a bearded man standing in front of a mountain cabin, remarkably detailed for a child's artwork. But what made Obadiah's breath catch was the accuracy of the portrait. It was unmistakably him, down to the scar on his chin and the way he stood with his left shoulder slightly raised. "Where did you see this man?" he asked carefully. Charity tilted her head, studying his face with disturbing intensity. "Mama used to tell us stories about him. She said he lived in the mountains and watched over people, even when they didn't know he was there. She said someday we might meet him, and we'd know him when we did because he'd have kind eyes hiding behind a sad face." The description hit Obadiah like a physical blow. He handed the drawing back with shaking hands, unsure how to respond. How could a child he'd never met draw such an accurate portrait? How could her mother have known enough about him to describe him so precisely to her daughters? That night, sleep eluded him completely. He lay in his bed, listening to the quiet breathing of his unexpected guests and trying to understand the impossible connections that seemed to be forming around him. The rational part of his mind insisted that the similarities between his story and Vernon's were mere coincidence, that the child's drawing was just artistic talent combined with lucky guessing. But deep down, he sensed that forces larger than coincidence were at work. The same instincts that had kept him alive during his war against the railroad were telling him that this encounter was anything but random. Someone or something had brought this family to his mountain, and the truth of why they'd been sent to him was still hidden, waiting to be revealed. As dawn approached, Obadiah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He was going to help Vernon and the twins not just survive, but fight back against the railroad corruption that had destroyed both their families. The hermit, who had spent 15 years avoiding human connection, was about to discover that some bonds were stronger than fear, and that family ties could reach across time and distance in ways that defied all rational explanation. The railroad survey map lay spread across his table like a battle plan, its red lines marking not just planned routes, but a web of greed and corruption that had gone unchallenged for too long. Tomorrow, he would begin asking questions in the settlements below. It was time for the mountain man to come down from his hiding place and remind certain people that some debts could never be forgotten. Patience, Whitfield's mother's silver locket, caught the morning light as she helped prepare breakfast, the delicate chain glinting against her worn dress. She wore it always, never taking it off even to sleep, and Obadiah had noticed how she touched it whenever she seemed worried or deep in thought. The locket was clearly precious to her, one of the few beautiful things the family had managed to keep through all their troubles. Vernon was recovering steadily, able to sit up for longer periods and take short walks around the cabin. The mountain air and regular meals were working their healing magic, bringing color back to his gaunt cheeks and strength to his voice. But with returning health came returning memory, and Vernon spent hours staring out the cabin windows with the haunted expression of a man reliving tragedies he couldn't prevent. Obadiah found himself struggling with emotions he'd thought buried forever. Having people in his cabin, especially children, awakened protective instincts that felt both familiar and dangerous. He caught himself listening for their breathing at night, checking to make sure they were warm enough, worrying about their safety in ways that reminded him painfully of fatherhood. The girls had settled into helping with daily chores without being asked. Patience proved remarkably capable for her age, able to cook simple meals and mend tears in their few clothes with surprising skill. Charity brought a different kind of contribution. Her artistic eye found beauty in the simplest things, arranging pine cones and smooth stones in patterns that somehow made the cabin feel more like a home than a fortress. During the quiet evening hours, Vernon began sharing more details about the systematic destruction of their lives. The pattern was even more calculated than Obadiah had initially realized. The railroad companies had developed a precise methodology for acquiring land, starting with reasonable offers and escalating through legal harassment, economic pressure, and finally violence. They kept files on every family, Vernon explained, his voice bitter and with remembered helplessness. Detailed reports about our finances, our relationships, our weaknesses. They knew exactly how much pressure each family could withstand before breaking. The names Vernon mentioned made Obadiah's jaw clench with old rage. Judge Morrison, now in his 70s, but still wielding corrupt influence from the territorial courthouse. Sheriff Caldwell, who had looked Obadiah in the eye and claimed there was no evidence of foul play in his family's deaths. Railroad Commissioner Blackthorne, the mastermind who orchestrated it all from his comfortable office in Denver, never getting his own hands dirty but profiting from every acre stolen. Morrison was the worst, Vernon continued. He'd rule against families in court, then buy their land at auction for a fraction of its value, sold it to the railroad for 10 times what he paid, then split the profits. Been doing it for years, but nobody could prove it, because he controlled all the court records. Obadiah remembered his own futile attempts to find justice through legal channels. The evidence that should have supported his case had mysteriously vanished from courthouse files. Witnesses had suddenly developed convenient amnesia or left town unexpectedly. The few honest officials had found themselves transferred to distant posts or facing trumped-up charges that ended their careers. "How many families?" Obadiah asked. Vernon pulled out a small notebook he'd managed to keep hidden throughout their ordeal. The pages were filled with names, dates, and brief notations about each family's fate. "At least 40 that I know about, probably more. Some fought back and just disappeared. Others signed the papers and moved away, broken. A few tried to organize resistance, but the railroad always found ways to divide us." The notebook, made for grim reading, Families with histories stretching back generations, reduced to brief entries documenting their destruction. Children orphaned, wives widowed, men driven to despair by forces they couldn't understand or fight. Each entry represented dreams crushed and lives destroyed for the sake of corporate profit. But it was the personal details that hit Obadiah hardest. Vernon's description of his wife Sarah painted a picture of a woman remarkably similar to Obadiah's own Margaret, strong-willed, protective of her family, unwilling to be intimidated by threats. Sarah had tried to organize the other wives, creating a network of mutual support that might have been effective if the railroad hadn't acted so decisively to eliminate her. She knew they were coming for her, Vernon said quietly. The night before she died, she made me promise to take care of the girls no matter what happened to her. She said there were family stories, old connections that might help us if we could find the right people. I never understood what she meant. Patience looked up from her sewing at her father's words, and Obadiah caught an expression of understanding flash across her young face. She touched her locket again, that habitual gesture that seemed to comfort her whenever difficult topics arose. There was something about the way she did it, not just seeking comfort, but as if she were checking to make sure something important was still there. Charity had been sketching while the adults talked, her charcoal moving across a piece of bark with the confident strokes of natural talent. When she finished, she brought the drawing to Obadiah with the shy pride of a child seeking approval. The image showed a family gathered around a fireplace, a bearded man, 2 women, and several children, all rendered with remarkable detail for such simple materials. "Is this your family before?" Charity asked, her innocent question cutting straight to the heart of Obadiah's carefully maintained defenses. He studied the drawing more carefully, noting details that seemed too accurate to be coincidental. The bearded man in the picture bore a sensuous, strong resemblance to how Obadiah might have looked 15 years ago. One of the women could have been Margaret, and the children's faces held familiar features. But it was the background details that truly unsettled him. The cabin interior shown in the drawing matched his own layout precisely, down to the placement of furniture and the pattern of stones around the fireplace. "How do you know about this?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. Charity tilted her head with the innocent confusion of a child who didn't understand why adults found certain things disturbing. "Mama used to tell us stories about the mountain uncle. She said he had a cabin just like this one, and that he took care of a family that lived here before us. She said the stories were true, but that uncle was very sad now because his family had to go away." Vernon was watching this exchange with growing puzzlement. "I never heard Sarah tell stories like that. When did she say these things?" "When Papa was working late," Patience answered, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. "Mama would brush our hair and tell us secret stories about family we might meet someday. She made us promise to remember them, especially the one about the mountain uncle who watched over people even when they didn't know he was there." The description matched what Charity had said before, but hearing it from both girls made it impossible to dismiss as childish imagination. Somehow, their mother had known about Obadiah with an accuracy that defied explanation. She'd prepared her daughters for this meeting, filling their minds with stories and images that would help them recognize a man they'd never met. Obadiah excused himself and stepped outside into the cool mountain air, his mind reeling with questions that had no rational answers. The coincidences were piling up beyond the realm of possibility. The same corrupt officials, the same methods of persecution, children who recognized him from stories their dead mother had told. It felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, but he couldn't yet see the complete picture. Standing in the shadow of the pine trees that had sheltered his solitude for 15 years, Obadiah realized that his carefully constructed isolation was crumbling. These people weren't just refugees seeking temporary shelter. They were somehow connected to his past in ways that made their presence feel inevitable rather than accidental. Tomorrow, he would need to make decisions about their future, about his own future, about whether he was ready to step back into a world that had already taken everything from him once. Tonight, he would sit by the fire and try to understand how three strangers could feel so much like family, and why the sound of children's voices in his cabin felt like an answer to prayers he'd been afraid to speak. The worn family Bible sat open on Obadiah's table, its leather binding cracked from years of handling, and its pages yellowed with age. Vernon had produced it from his traveling pack on their fifth morning in the cabin, explaining that it was one of the few possessions Sarah had insisted they save when they fled their home. The heavy book contained more than scripture. Its front pages held careful records of births, marriages, and deaths stretching back 3 generations. Vernon's strength had returned enough for him to sit comfortably for extended periods, and he'd begun sharing family stories that painted a picture of deep roots and proud traditions. The Whitfield name had been in Colorado Territory for nearly 40 years, among the early settlers who'd carved farms and communities out of wilderness that seemed determined to resist human habitation. Sarah's people came even earlier, Vernon explained, running his finger down the genealogical entries in the Bible's front matter. The Cranes settled in these mountains back in the 1832, before there was any territorial government or law except what families made for themselves. They were tough people, had to be to survive out here. The name hit Obadiah like a physical blow, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. Crane was his family name, though he hadn't spoken it aloud in 15 years. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right there in faded ink on pages that predated any possible deception. Patience had been listening to her father's recitation while working on mending clothes, but she looked up sharply when the name Crane was mentioned. Her hand went instinctively to her mother's locket, and Obadiah caught a flash of recognition in her eyes before she quickly looked down at her sewing again. "Tell me about the Cranes," Obadiah said, working to keep his voice steady. Vernon turned more pages, finding entries that dated back to the earliest settlements. According to Sarah, her grandfather was Josiah Crane, came out here with his 2 sons to establish a trading post. One son stayed and built the family farm, had 3 daughters, including Sarah's mother. The other son was supposed to join them later, but there was some kind of family dispute. He disappeared into the mountains and was never heard from again. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if even the mountain wind was holding its breath. Obadiah's father had indeed been named Josiah, and he'd had a brother who'd remained in the east when the family came west. But according to family stories, that brother had died in the Civil War. The timeline Vernon was describing suggested a different version of events entirely. "What was the dispute about?" Obadiah asked. Sarah was never completely clear on the details. Something about land rights and agreements that were broken. But she always said her family carried guilt about it, that they'd failed someone who needed their help. She used to say that if she ever had the chance to make things right, she would. Charity had been sketching while the adults talked, but now she set down her charcoal and approached the table where the Bible lay open. With the confidence of a child who'd been taught to revere family records, she pointed to one of the entries near the bottom of the page. "Mama showed us this one," she said quietly. "She said this was the uncle who got lost, and that someday we might find him again if we kept the stories alive." Obadiah leaned closer to read the entry Charity was indicating. Written in careful script was, "Obadiah Josiah Crane, born 1825, departed for Western Territories 1859, a fate unknown but remembered in prayers." The words swam before his eyes as 15 years of careful emotional control began to crumble. His full name, his birth year, even the year he'd left his extended family behind to start fresh in Colorado Territory. It was all there in records that predated his hermit existence by decades. "The lost uncle," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. Vernon was studying Obadiah's face, with growing understanding. "You're him, aren't you?" Sarah always said we might recognize him by his eyes, said the Crane men. All had the same way of looking at the world, like they could see trouble coming from miles away. Patience and Charity had moved to stand on either side of Obadiah's chair, their young faces solemn with the weight of a revelation that was reshaping their understanding of the world. The mountain hermit who'd rescued them wasn't a stranger at all, but the family member their mother had told them to watch for. She knew, Patience said quietly. Mama knew we'd find you eventually. She said the mountains called to Crane men, and that if we ever got lost, we should head for the high country because family would be watching. The implications were staggering. Sarah Whitfield had somehow known not just that Obadiah was alive, but where he could be found. She'd prepared her daughters for an encounter that must have seemed impossible, a chance meeting with an uncle who'd been lost for decades. The secret stories the girls had mentioned weren't just tales to entertain children, but careful preparation for a reunion that Sarah had somehow foreseen. Obadiah found himself studying the twins with new eyes, looking for family resemblances he'd been too cautious to notice before. Patience had the strong jaw and determined expression that ran in Crane bloodlines, while Charity's artistic sensitivity reminded him of his own daughter, Ruth. But it was more than physical features. Something in their manner, their resilience, their quiet strength spoke of shared heritage. "How did she know I was up here?" Obadiah asked. Vernon shook his head slowly. "She never said exactly, but Sarah had ways of knowing things that seemed impossible. Mountain folks used to come to her for advice about weather and crops, said she had gift for seeing patterns others missed. Maybe she heard stories from trappers or traders, pieced together information over years." The paused explanation seemed insufficient for the depth of knowledge Sarah had possessed, but it was the only rational answer available. More important was what this revelation meant for the future. These weren't just refugees he'd taken in out of compassion, they were blood family, children who carried his own heritage and memories he'd thought lost forever. Charity climbed onto his lap with the easy affection of a child who decided he belonged to her family. "Does this mean you're really our uncle? The one Mama said would take care of us if something bad happened?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying the hopes and fears of two children who'd lost almost everything, but still believed in the possibility of home and safety. Obadiah looked into their trusting faces and realized that 15 years of isolation had come to an end, not through his own choice, but through the patient working of family bonds he'd never imagined still existed. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he'd held back for too long. "I'm your Uncle Obadiah, and I'm going to make sure nothing bad happens to you ever again." The promise felt dangerous even as he spoke it, a commitment that opened him to exactly the kind of loss he'd spent 15 years avoiding. But looking at Vernon's grateful expression and feeling the twins' small hands in his, Obadiah realized that some risks were worth taking. Family wasn't just about blood, it was about choosing to protect and cherish the people who mattered most, regardless of the cost. The bundle of railroad company letters lay spread across Obadiah's table like evidence in a criminal trial, each document bearing the official letterhead of the Denver and Pacific Railroad Company. Vernon had kept them hidden in a waterproof pouch throughout their flight, understanding instinctively that these papers represented more than just correspondence. They were proof of a systematic campaign of intimidation and theft that stretched across the territory. The earliest letters, dated nearly 2 years ago, maintained a veneer of politeness and legal procedure. They spoke of progress and development, of the greater good that would come from connecting remote settlements to the growing railroad network. The offers for the Whitfield property were presented as generous opportunities rather than ultimatums, complete with official surveys and legal descriptions that made everything seem legitimate and proper. But as Obadiah read through the chronological progression of correspondence, the tone shifted dramatically. Polite requests became firm demands. Legal procedures gave way to barely veiled threats. The final letters dispensed with pretense entirely, describing consequences for continued resistance in language that left no doubt about the railroad's willingness to use violence. "This one came the day before Sarah died," Vernon said, pointing to a letter bearing Commissioner Blackthorne's personal signature. The message was brief and chilling. "Final notice. Vacate property within 48 hours or face removal by territorial authority. No further communication will be necessary." Obadiah recognized the pattern because he'd lived through it himself 15 years earlier. The railroad companies had refined their tactics since then, but the underlying strategy remained the same: create an appearance of legal procedure while applying pressure that made resistance impossible. Families were given choices that weren't really choices, forced to decide between signing away their heritage or watching it be taken by force. "They made it seem legal," Vernon continued, his voice heavy with bitter understanding. "Every step had paperwork, official seals, signatures from territorial officials. If you didn't know better, you'd think they had every right to do what they were doing." The letters revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond what Obadiah had imagined during his own fight with railroad. Judges signed seizure orders based on trumped-up tax claims. Sheriffs served eviction notices backed by territorial authority. Government surveyors provided false assessments that undervalued properties by enormous margins. The entire territorial administration seemed to be working in concert to facilitate the railroad's land acquisition program. Vernon's decision to investigate had begun after Sarah's death, when grief had given way to cold anger and a determination to understand exactly who was responsible for destroying his family. He'd traveled to other settlements, talking to families who'd suffered similar losses, gradually assembling a picture of organized criminality that shocked him with its scope and audacity. "I found 43 families who'd been forced off their land in the past 5 years," Vernon explained, consulting the notebook that had become his obsession. "Same pattern every time: reasonable offers, followed by legal harassment, followed by mysterious accidents. But the railroad always managed to acquire the properties they needed, usually for a fraction of what they were worth." Obadiah studied the names in Vernon's notebook, recognizing several from his own investigations years earlier. But Vernon had uncovered connections that Obadiah had missed. Patterns of cooperation between officials who'd seemed independent but were actually working together in carefully orchestrated campaigns. The twins had been listening to their father's explanations with the solemn attention of children who understood that adult conversations sometimes contained information vital to their survival. Patience helped organize the documents by date, while Charity sketched portraits of the men whose names appeared repeatedly in the correspondence. Judge Morrison's cruel eyes, Sheriff Caldwell's weak chin, Commissioner Blackthorne's satisfied smirk. "We should take this to Denver," Patience suggested with the logical clarity that characterized her thinking. "Show it to people who can arrest the bad men and make them give back what they stole." Obadiah exchanged glances with Vernon, both men understanding what the child was too young to grasp, that the corruption extended far beyond local officials into the territorial government itself. The people with authority to investigate and prosecute were the same people who'd been facilitating the crimes in the first place. "It's not that simple, sweetheart," Vernon explained gently. "The men who did this to us have friends in high places. They've made sure that anyone with the power to stop them is either working with them or too afraid to act." But Patience's suggestion sparked an idea in Obadiah's mind. The letters Vernon had collected, combined with the evidence Obadiah had gathered during his own campaign against the railroad, might be enough to build a case that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore. Not through official channels, those were hopelessly compromised, but through public exposure that would make continued cooperation politically impossible. "There's someone who might be able to help," Obadiah said slowly. "Marcus Flynn runs a newspaper in Colorado Springs. He's been writing about railroad corruption for years, but he's never had access to documentation this detailed. If we could get these letters to him, along with the stories of all the families who've been destroyed, Vernon's eyes lit up with the first hope Obadiah had seen in him since they'd met. "You think he'd publish it? Really tell the whole story?" "Flynn's honest," Obadiah confirmed. "Lost his own brother to a railroad accident in Kansas, so he's got personal reasons for wanting the truth exposed. But it would be dangerous. Once these letters become public, Blackthorne and his associates will know exactly who provided them. They won't hesitate to retaliate." The prospect of danger didn't seem to concern Vernon as much as the possibility of justice. After months of running and hiding, the chance to fight back appealed to something fundamental in his character. But it was Charity who voiced what everyone in the room was thinking. "What about us?" she asked quietly. "If Uncle Obadiah helps Papa fight the bad men, does that mean we have to leave the cabin? Does that mean we can't be a family anymore?" The question cut straight to the heart of Obadiah's internal conflict. Taking action against the railroad would mean abandoning the safety of isolation, exposing himself and his newfound family to exactly the kind of retaliation that had destroyed his life once before. But doing nothing would mean allowing the corruption to continue, condemning other families to the same fate that had befallen the Whitfields. Looking at the twins' trusting faces, Obadiah realized that his choice had already been made. Family wasn't something you protected by hiding from the world. It was something you protected by standing up to the forces that threatened it. The hermit, who'd spent 15 years avoiding human connection, was about to discover that some fights were worth the risk, and that courage could be found not in isolation, but in the bonds that connected people to something larger than themselves. Tomorrow he would begin the journey down from his mountain sanctuary, carrying evidence that might finally bring justice to the men who'd destroyed so many innocent lives. The war he'd fought 15 years ago was about to resume, but this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. The handmade quilt lay spread across the cabin's main room, like a map of forgotten memories, its intricate patterns catching the firelight and casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Sarah Whitfield had spent months creating this masterpiece during the long winter before her death, working by candlelight after her daughters were asleep, stitching together scraps of fabric that told the story of her family's heritage in ways that only those who knew the code could understand. Vernon had been reluctant to unwrap the quilt at first, explaining that it was one of the few things of Sarah's that the girls had been able to keep. But Patience had insisted, saying that her mother had told them the quilt contained important information that would help them understand their family history when the time was right. Now, seeing it displayed in Obadiah's cabin, the reason for her insistence became clear. The central pattern depicted a mountain scene rendered in blues and grays, with a small cabin nestled among towering peaks. But it wasn't just any mountain landscape. The details were specific enough to represent the actual geography surrounding Obadiah's home. Sarah had somehow known not just that her brother-in-law lived in the mountains, but exactly where to find him. Surrounding the mountain scene were smaller panels that told stories in the visual language of traditional quilting. A lone figure standing beside a grave. A family walking away from a burning homestead. A railroad locomotive pursuing a wagon train across open plains. Each image represented a chapter in the Crane family tragedy, sewn together with the patience and skill of a woman determined to preserve truth through beauty. "Mama worked on this every night," Charity explained, running her small fingers along the careful stitches that held the narrative together. She said it was important to finish it before spring came, that someone would need to read the story someday. Obadiah studied the quilt with growing amazement and sorrow. Sarah had known she was running out of time, had understood that her family would need guidance she wouldn't be there to provide. The quilt was her way of ensuring that vital information would survive, even if she didn't, encoded in patterns that would mean nothing to enemies, but everything to family who knew how to interpret them. Vernon traced one of the panels with his finger, his voice thick with emotion. "I never understood what she was doing. She'd work on it for hours, sometimes unpicking sections and starting over if they didn't look exactly right. I thought she was just keeping her hands busy during the long evenings. But it was more than record-keeping. It was prophecy made manifest in fabric and thread. The final panel showed 3 figures approaching the mountain cabin, their faces turned upward toward a bearded man standing in the doorway. The scene was so accurate to their actual arrival that it seemed impossible Sarah could have created it months before the events occurred. "She knew we'd find you," Patience said quietly. "Mama always said the quilt would make sense when we reached the right place. She said the patterns would tell us things we needed to know about our family." Obadiah was beginning to understand that Sarah Whitfield had possessed knowledge that went far beyond what any normal investigation could have revealed. She'd known about his existence, his location, even the circumstances that would bring her family to his door. The question was how a woman he'd never met could have understood so much about his life. "Tell me about your mother," he said to the twins. "What was she like? How did she know things?" The girls exchanged glances, the wordless communication of siblings who'd shared experiences others wouldn't understand. It was Charity who answered first, her artistic nature making her more comfortable with concepts that defied logical explanation. "Mama could see patterns in things," she said carefully. "She'd look at clouds and know what weather was coming weeks ahead. She could tell when people were lying just by watching their faces. And sometimes she'd get quiet and sad, like she was remembering things that hadn't happened yet." Patience nodded agreement, adding her own observations with characteristic precision. "She used to say that family connections were like underground streams. You couldn't always see them, but they were always flowing. She said the Crane bloodline carried gifts that came with responsibilities, and that someday we'd understand what that meant." The description painted a picture of a woman with intuitive abilities that bordered on the supernatural, but more than that, it suggested Sarah had been preparing her daughters for a destiny she'd somehow foreseen. The secret stories about their mountain uncle weren't just entertainment, they were careful instruction for a journey she'd known they would eventually make. Vernon had been listening with the expression of a man discovering truths about his wife that he'd never suspected during their years together. She always seemed to know things she shouldn't have been able to know. When neighbors were sick, she'd show up with medicine before anyone told her they needed help. She could predict which crops would fail and which would flourish, even when weather conditions seemed identical. She said, knowledge came through dreams. Patience continued, that if you paid attention to your dreams and learned to understand their language, they would tell you important things about the past and future. She taught us to remember our dreams and look for patterns in them. Obadiah found himself remembering dreams he'd had in recent weeks, vague images of children's voices in his cabin, a sense of family presence that had seemed like wishful thinking at the time. Perhaps Sarah's gifts weren't entirely unique to her. Perhaps the Crane bloodline did carry sensitivities that allowed some family members to perceive connections others missed. "Did she dream about me?" he asked. Charity nodded solemnly. She said she dreamed about the sad uncle in the mountains lots of times. She saw him standing by a grave, and she knew he was family even though she'd never seen his face before. She said the dreams told her that someday her daughters would need him, and that he would need them too. The circular nature of the connection was beginning to make sense. Sarah hadn't just foreseen their meeting, she'd understood that healing would flow both directions. Obadiah's isolation had been as much a wound as the twins' loss of parents, and bringing them together would begin mending damage that had festered for too long. Looking at the quilt's intricate patterns, Obadiah realized he was holding more than just a family heirloom. This was a testament to the persistence of love across time and distance, proof that some bonds couldn't be broken by death or separation. Sarah Whitfield had reached across the grave to guide her family toward the reunion she'd known would save them all. The mountain hermit, who'd spent 15 years convinced he was alone in the world, was about to discover that family was more than shared blood. It was shared destiny. And some destinies were powerful enough to reshape reality itself. The letter was worn soft from years of careful folding and unfolding, its edges frayed and the ink faded to a pale brown that spoke of age and cherished handling. Vernon had carried it close to his heart through all their trials, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath layers of clothing where no amount of rain or rough travel could damage it. Now, on what he believed might be his final night of life, as his fever returned with frightening intensity, he pulled the precious document from its hiding place with trembling hands. "This came from your brother," Vernon whispered to Obadiah, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "From my father. He wrote it the night before he died. Made me promise to find you someday and deliver it personal." The words hit Obadiah like a physical blow, rendering him momentarily speechless as 15 years of carefully constructed beliefs about his past began to crumble. His brother had died in the land dispute that destroyed his family, that was the foundation upon which he'd built his hermit existence, the tragedy that justified his withdrawal from human connection. But Vernon was claiming to be the son of that same brother, suggesting a survival and a history that changed everything. With hands that shook from more than fever, Vernon pressed the letter into Obadiah's palm. The paper felt fragile as ancient parchment, but the writing was clear enough to read in the firelight. The salutation alone was enough to confirm Vernon's stunning claim. "My dear brother Obadiah, if you are reading this, then my son has found you as I prayed he would." Obadiah's vision blurred as he read the familiar handwriting of Samuel Crane, the brother he'd mourned as dead for 15 years. The letter continued in the measured cadence of a man who knew his time was running short, but had vital information to convey. "I survived the attack on our farm, though Sarah's mother and my first wife did not. The railroad men left me for dead, but neighbors found me in time to save my life, if not my livelihood. By the time I recovered enough to search for you, you had vanished into the mountains like smoke in the wind. I spent years trying to find you, but you had hidden yourself too well. I remarried a good woman named Mary Hutchinson, and we had a son we named Vernon after her father. When Vernon was old enough to understand, I told him about his uncle in the mountains, the brother who'd tried so hard to protect our family and blamed himself when protection wasn't enough. I made him promise that if anything happened to me, he would find you and tell you the truth, that none of what befell us was your fault, and that family forgiveness reaches across any distance." The letter went on to describe Samuel's life in the years after the railroad attack, his struggles to rebuild while caring for an infant son and a traumatized wife who'd lost her first husband to the same corporate violence. He'd eventually established a small farm near Canyon Creek, far enough from railroad interests to avoid further persecution, but close enough to civilization to provide for his family's needs. "Vernon has grown into a fine man," the letter continued, "strong and principled like our father, with the Crane's stubborn streak that serves families well in hard times. He married Sarah Hutchinson, Mary's niece, a woman blessed with gifts of insight that remind me of our grandmother's stories about the old country. Their twin daughters carry the best of both family lines, courage from the Cranes, wisdom from the Hutchinsons." Obadiah's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper steady. The twins sitting beside him weren't just distant relatives, they were his brother's granddaughters, blood family as close as any he would ever find. The uncle they'd been seeking wasn't a figure from old family stories, but their grandfather's brother, the man who'd disappeared into the mountains carrying guilt and grief that had never been his to bear. "I have watched for signs that you survived," Samuel's letter continued. "And mountain folk sometimes speak of a ghost in the high country who protects travelers and punishes those who prey on the innocent. I choose to believe these stories refer to you, that you found a way to continue the fight that cost us both so much. If that is true, then you should know that your efforts have not gone unnoticed or unappreciated." The revelation that his activities against the railroad had reached his brother's ears came as another shock. Obadiah had thought his campaign of vengeance was known only to his enemies and a few territorial officials. But apparently, word of the mysterious Mountain Avenger had spread through communities where such stories offered hope to families facing similar persecution. Vernon struggled to sit up straighter, his fever-bright eyes fixed on his uncle's face. He made me memorize parts of it in case the letter got lost or stolen. Said it was important, that he never blamed you for what happened, that he understood why you had to disappear but hoped someday you'd come back to us. Patience and Charity had moved closer during the reading, and their young faces, solemn with the weight of revelations that were reshaping their understanding of family and identity. They were no longer orphaned refugees dependent on a stranger's charity. They were part of a bloodline with deep roots and proud traditions, children whose place in the world was secure because family bonds had proven stronger than time and separation. "Papa is really our grandfather's brother?" Charity asked, her artistic mind trying to process relationships that seemed too complex for such young understanding. "Your great-uncle," Vernon corrected gently, "which makes him the closest thing to a grandfather you're ever likely to have, since mine passed before you were born and your grandmother's family is scattered across the territory." The correction carried emotional weight that went far beyond genealogical accuracy. In a time and place where family networks meant the difference between survival and catastrophe, having a blood relative with resources and protective capabilities was invaluable security. But more than practical considerations, the twins were discovering that they belonged somewhere, that their place in the world was anchored by connections that reached back through generations. Obadiah finished reading the letter in silence, absorbing details about his brother's life and death that filled in gaps he'd carried for 15 years. Samuel had died peacefully, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that his son would carry on Crane traditions of loyalty and protection. His final words, according to the letter, had been instructions for Vernon to find his uncle and tell him it was time to come home. "He knew you were alive," Vernon continued, his voice growing weaker as the effort of revelation drained his remaining strength. "Said he could feel it somehow, that Crane men had a way of sensing when family was combat in danger or in need. Sarah inherited some of that gift from her mother's line. That's how she knew to prepare the girls for finding you." The circular nature of the family gifts was becoming clear. Sarah's prophetic dreams, the twins' intuitive recognition of their uncle, even Obadiah's unexplained compulsion to descend the mountain on the morning he found them, all of it suggested connections that operated beyond normal understanding. The Crane bloodline carried sensitivities that allowed family members to find each other across impossible distances and circumstances. Looking at Vernon's exhausted face and the twins' hopeful expressions, Obadiah realized that 15 years of self-imposed exile were finally coming to an end. He was no longer a hermit hiding from a world that had taken everything from him. He was the patriarch of a family that had survived against impossible odds and found each other through a combination of determination, gift, and pure stubborn will. The brother he'd mourned was truly dead, but his legacy lived on in a son who dedicated his life to fulfilling a deathbed promise, and 2 granddaughters who carried the best qualities of multiple family lines. The isolated mountain man who'd rescued strangers from a collapsed homestead had actually been answering a call that had traveled across years and miles, guided by love that proved stronger than death itself. The military medals lay scattered across Obadiah's table, like fragments of a life he'd tried to forget, their tarnished surfaces reflecting the firelight in muted flashes of gold and silver. He'd kept them hidden in a wooden box beneath his bed for 15 years, symbols of honor that had felt meaningless after his family's destruction. But now, as he prepared to leave his mountain sanctuary and confront the forces that had destroyed 2 generations of Cranes, those medals represented something more than past service. They were proof of skills that might be the difference between justice and annihilation. Vernon's revelation had changed everything. transforming Obadiah's understanding of his place in the world and his responsibilities to the living. The guilt that had driven him into isolation was revealed as misplaced self-blame, while the family connections he'd thought severed forever had proven stronger than time and distance. But with that understanding came new obligations that weighed heavier than any burden he'd carried as a hermit. Distinguished Service Cross. Vernon read from the inscription on the largest medal, his voice still weak but growing stronger each day. Mexican War, 1847. Captain Obadiah Crane, for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. He looked up at his uncle with new respect. You never mentioned you were an officer. Obadiah, uncomfortable, shifted in his chair, unused to discussing military service that felt like ancient history. Different time, different war. Skills you learn in uniform don't always translate to civilian life the way people expect. But that wasn't entirely true, and they all knew it. The tactical thinking that had made him an effective officer was exactly what they needed now to confront an enemy that operated through corruption and intimidation rather than open battle. The railroad conspiracy had succeeded for so long precisely because no one had approached it with military discipline and strategic planning. Patience studied a smaller medal with the intensity she brought to everything that captured her interest. "What's this one for, Uncle Obadiah?" "Meritorious conduct during the siege of Vera Cruz," he replied quietly. "I was a sergeant then, responsible for keeping my men alive while politicians decided whether the war was worth fighting." The parallel to their current situation wasn't lost on any of them. Once again, Obadiah found himself responsible for protecting family against forces that operated with institutional authority but questionable legitimacy. The difference was that this time he understood the stakes from the beginning and had time to plan accordingly. Over the past week, as Vernon recovered and the family bonds deepened, they'd developed what amounted to a military campaign against the railroad corruption network. The evidence Vernon had collected, combined with Obadiah's own intelligence from his previous war against the system, provided a comprehensive picture of criminal operations that stretched across the territory. Marcus Flynn's newspaper has circulation in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Pueblo, Obadiah explained, referring to the journalist who represented their best hope for exposing the conspiracy through legitimate channels. If we can get our evidence to him safely, along with sworn statements from some of the families who've been victimized, he'll have enough material to force a territorial investigation. The plan sounded straightforward, but everyone in the cabin understood the dangers involved. Commissioner Blackthorne and his associates had killed to protect their operations before, and they wouldn't hesitate to do so again if they felt threatened by exposure. Getting evidence to Flynn would require traveling through territory controlled by corrupt officials who would recognize Obadiah on sight and eliminate him without hesitation. "I should go alone," Obadiah said, voicing what he knew the others were thinking. "You and the girls need to stay here where it's safe. If something goes wrong, no." Vernon's interruption was quiet but firm. "This is my fight as much as yours. These men killed my wife, stole my land, orphaned my daughters. I'm not hiding in the mountains while you risk your life to get justice for crimes they committed against my family." The twins had been listening to the adult planning with the serious attention of children who understood that their future depended on decisions being made around the table. Now, Patience spoke up with the logical clarity that characterized her thinking. "If Papa goes with you, who will protect us if the bad men find the cabin?" It was the question that had been troubling Obadiah most. Taking Vernon along would double their chances of success, but leave the girls vulnerable to retaliation. Staying together kept the family safe, but made the mission nearly impossible. Either choice carried risks that could result in losing the family he'd only just discovered. Charity had been sketching while the adults talked, her charcoal moving across bark paper with the unconscious skill that characterized her artistic gift. Now she brought her drawing to the table with the shy pride of a child seeking adult approval. The image showed a mountain scene with multiple figures, some approaching the cabin from different directions, while others prepared defenses from concealed positions. Mama used to say that problems sometimes solve themselves if you look at them from different angles. Charity explained. Maybe the answer isn't choosing between staying together and going apart. Maybe it's finding help from people who want the same thing we want. The simple wisdom of a child's perspective cut through complexity that had been troubling the adults for hours. There were other families who'd suffered from railroad persecution, other men who had reasons to want Blackthorne and his associates brought to justice. Instead of fighting alone, they could build the alliance that previous resistance efforts had lacked. Timothy Morrison runs a small spread about 20 miles south, Vernon said slowly, his mind following the same logic. Lost his eldest son to a railroad accident 2 years ago. Never believed the official story, but he had no proof and no way to fight back alone. Obadiah nodded, remembering Morrison from his own intelligence gathering. Good man, former cavalry sergeant. He'd understand the tactical advantages of coordinated action over individual revenge. The strategy began taking shape as they talked through possibilities and connections. 3 or 4 reliable men with military experience, each with personal reasons for wanting the railroad conspiracy exposed, working together to ensure that evidence reached Flynn safely while protecting their families from retaliation. It was the kind of small unit action that Obadiah had excelled at during his military service. How long to organize it? Vernon asked. 2 weeks to make contact and coordinate, Obadiah estimated. Another week to brief everyone on the plan and establish fallback positions. If we move too fast, we'll make mistakes. If we wait too long, Blackthorne might discover what we're planning and take countermeasures. The timeline meant 3 more weeks of hiding and preparation. 3 more weeks of living with the constant fear that their enemies might discover the cabin and eliminate the threat before it could develop. But it also meant 3 more weeks of family time. 3 more weeks of watching the twins grow stronger and more confident in their newfound security. Patience climbed onto Obadiah's lap with the easy affection that had developed between them, her small hand tracing the ribbons on his military medals. "Are you scared, Uncle Obadiah?" The question deserved an honest answer, even from a child. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm scared that something might happen to you and your sister and your father. That's what makes it important to be very careful and very smart about how we handle this. But you're going to protect us no matter what." "No matter what," he confirmed, the promise feeling as binding as any oath he'd taken during his military service. Looking around the cabin that had been his hermit refuge but was rapidly becoming a family home, Obadiah realized that everything he'd built during 15 years of isolation was about to be risked on a single campaign for justice. The safe, solitary life he'd constructed was giving way to something far more dangerous, but infinitely more meaningful. The mountain man who'd rescued strangers from a collapsed homestead had evolved into the patriarch of a family with deep roots and dangerous enemies. Tomorrow he would begin the work of transforming personal vengeance into coordinated justice, knowing that failure would mean not just his own death, but the destruction of the family he'd only just learned to love. Some wars, he reflected as he studied the faces of his nephew and great-nieces, were worth any risk because the alternative was surrendering everything that made life worth living. This would be such a war. The pocket watch had belonged to 3 generations of crane men, its golden surface worn smooth by countless hands, and its internal mechanism keeping perfect time despite decades of hard use. Vernon pressed it into Obadiah's palm with ceremonial solemnity, understanding that he was passing more than just a family heirloom. He was transferring the responsibility of family leadership to the man best equipped to carry it forward. "Father gave this to me on my wedding day," Vernon said, his voice thick with emotion and the weight of tradition. said it represented the unbroken chain of Crane family values, that whoever carried it was responsible for protecting everyone who shared our blood. I should have given it to you weeks ago, but I wasn't ready to admit how much we needed your protection. The watch felt heavier than its actual weight, carrying the accumulated expectations of generations who'd faced impossible odds and somehow survived. Obadiah studied the inscription on the back cover, "To Samuel Crane, from his loving father, 1845. Time reveals all truths." The irony wasn't lost on him. Time had indeed revealed truths that changed everything he thought he knew about family and responsibility. The sound of approaching horses cut through the morning air like a blade, sending immediate tension through the cabin's occupants. Obadiah moved to the window with practiced stealth, his military instincts taking over as he assessed the threat developing in the clearing below. 5 mounted men were approaching the cabin with the confident bearing of officials conducting legitimate business, but the heavy guns they carried suggested they were prepared for resistance. "Railroad men," Obadiah confirmed grimly, recognizing the lead rider as Thomas Grayson, one of Commissioner Blackthorne's most trusted enforcers. "They've found us." Vernon was already moving to gather the twins, his protective instincts overriding the weakness that still lingered from his recent illness. Patience and Charity responded with the quick efficiency of children who'd learned that adult urgency meant immediate danger, collecting their few possessions and moving toward the cabin's back exit without being told. "How many?" Vernon asked, checking the load on the rifle Obadiah had given him for just such an emergency. 5 that I can see, probably more, positioned as backup in case we try to run." Obadiah's assessment was calm and professional, his military training automatically calculating odds and tactical options. "They're not here to negotiate. Grayson doesn't ride out for conversation." The lead rider dismounted with theatrical flourish, clearly enjoying the power dynamic of armed men, confronting what he assumed was a helpless family. Grayson was a large man who'd learned to use his size and official authority to intimidate people who couldn't fight back effectively. He'd built a reputation for brutal efficiency in handling problems that embarrassed the railroad's public image. "Obadiah Crane," Grayson called out, his voice carrying the mock courtesy that characterized men accustomed to having their demands met without question. "Commissioner Blackthorne sends his regards and an invitation to discuss matters of mutual interest. He's prepared to be very generous in exchange for certain documents that have gone missing." That offer confirmed what Obadiah had suspected. Someone had informed the railroad about Vernon's evidence collection, probably through connections in one of the settlements where they'd made inquiries. The conspiracy's intelligence network was more extensive than they'd realized, reaching into communities they'd assumed were safe from corporate influence. "Tell Blackthorne that the Crane family has nothing to discuss with railroad representatives," Obadiah replied through the cabin's reinforced door. "Any business he wants to conduct can go through proper legal channels in Denver." Grayson's laughter was harsh and mocking. "Legal channels? That's rich, coming from a man who spent 6 months attacking railroad property like some kind of mountain bandit. We know exactly who you are, Crane, and what you've been doing up here. The territorial government has authorized us to bring you in for questioning about criminal activities against interstate commerce." The claim was almost certainly false. No territorial court would issue warrants based on 15-year-old allegations without extensive evidence and testimony. But Grayson wasn't operating under legal authority so much as corporate mandate, using official language to provide a thin veneer of legitimacy for what amounted to kidnapping and murder. "Last chance, Crane," Grayson continued when no response came from the cabin. "Come out peacefully with the documents, and maybe we can work something out that keeps your family safe. Keep playing games, and we'll handle this the hard way." The threat was exactly what Obadiah had expected and prepared for. The cabin's defensive modifications weren't obvious from the outside, but 15 years of military thinking had gone into making the structure nearly impregnable against small arms attack. Heavy timber walls, reinforced door frames, and carefully positioned firing ports would allow a small force to hold off much larger numbers for extended periods. "Take the girls to the root cellar," Obadiah instructed Vernon quietly. "There's a tunnel that leads to the cave system behind the waterfall. If something happens to me, follow it to the end and wait for nightfall before moving. Timothy Morrison's place is 15 miles southeast. He'll help you get to safety." Vernon gripped his uncle's shoulder with desperate intensity. "We're not leaving you to face this alone. This is our fight too. Your fight is keeping those girls alive," Obadiah replied firmly. "Everything else is secondary to that responsibility." The pocket watch in his palm seemed to pulse with the steady rhythm of family duty that stretched back through generations. Time was revealing another truth, that some battles could only be won by those willing to sacrifice everything for the people they loved most. The original land deed lay spread across the table like a declaration of war, its faded ink and official seals representing everything the railroad conspiracy had tried to steal and destroy. Vernon had kept it hidden through months of persecution, understanding that this single document could unravel years of carefully constructed lies about legal ownership and territorial authority. Now, as gunfire erupted outside the cabin, it served as both evidence and inspiration for the final confrontation that would determine their family's fate. Grayson's patience had lasted exactly 10 minutes before he ordered his men to take the cabin by force. The first volley of rifle fire struck the reinforced walls harmlessly, the bullets embedding in timber that Obadiah had selected and positioned specifically to withstand such attacks. His 15 years of mountain isolation hadn't been spent in passive. Hiding every modification to the cabin had been designed with defensive warfare in mind. "They're spreading out to surround us," Vernon reported from his position at the rear window, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The twins had been safely secured in the root cellar, but he'd refused to abandon his uncle when the shooting started. Two men heading for the blind spot behind the woodshed, Obadiah moved with the fluid efficiency of a soldier who'd fought in close quarters before, checking sight lines and ammunition while calculating the tactical advantages his preparation had created. The cabin's position on elevated ground provided excellent fields of fire, while the surrounding pine forest offered concealment for anyone who knew the terrain well enough to use it effectively. The sound of splintering wood announced Grayson's escalation to more direct methods. His men were using axes to attack the cabin's door, confident that overwhelming force would quickly end resistance from what they assumed was an isolated family with limited resources. They had no way of knowing they were assaulting a position that had been fortified by a man with extensive military engineering experience. "Crane!" Grayson's voice carried frustration and mounting anger. "You're only making this harder on yourself. Come out now, and we'll make it quick. Keep fighting, and we'll take our time with you and your family." The threat revealed everything about the railroad's true intentions. This wasn't a legal arrest or even a criminal intimidation. It was an execution disguised as law enforcement, designed to eliminate witnesses who possessed evidence of corporate crimes. Obadiah had seen similar operations during his war service, when political objectives required the permanent silencing of inconvenient truths. A rifle barrel appeared at the side window, followed immediately by a muzzle flash as one of Grayson's men attempted to provide covering fire for the assault on the door. Obadiah's return shot was precise and immediate, dropping the attacker with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd learned to kill quickly and without hesitation when family survival was at stake. "One down," he reported to Vernon, his voice carrying the calm professionalism that combat veterans used to maintain focus under extreme stress. "4 left, but they're getting more cautious now." The cabin's defensive advantages were becoming apparent to the attackers, who'd expected to overwhelm a hermit's refuge, but found themselves facing a military-grade fortification. Grayson was smart enough to recognize when tactics needed adjustment, pulling his remaining men back to reassess their approach. "Burn them out," Grayson ordered, his voice carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. "The old man wants to play soldier. We'll show him what happens to people who interfere with railroad business." The threat of fire was the one defensive scenario Obadiah had hoped to avoid. No amount of timber reinforcement could protect against sustained incendiary attack, and the cabin's isolated location meant no outside help would arrive in time to make a difference. But fire also meant the attackers would have to get close enough to be vulnerable to accurate rifle fire from prepared positions. Vernon was watching his uncle's face with the intensity of a man trying to read their chances of survival in another man's expression. "What do we do when they come with torches?" "We remind them that some fights cost more than the prize is worth," Obadiah replied, checking the load on his rifle with practiced efficiency. "And we make sure that if something happens to us, the evidence survives to expose what they've done." The land deed represented more than just property ownership. It was proof of systematic theft that reached from local corruption to territorial government, a documentation that could bring down the entire conspiracy if it reached the right hands. Vernon had copies hidden in multiple locations, insurance against exactly the kind of violent suppression they were facing. Outside, they could hear Grayson's men preparing for the final assault, gathering materials for torches, and positioning themselves for coordinated attack. The mountain morning that had begun with family breakfast and quiet planning was about to climax in violence that would determine whether justice or corruption prevailed in the Colorado Territory. Obadiah touched the pocket watch in his vest, feeling its steady rhythm against his chest, like a heartbeat, connecting him to generations of Crane men who'd faced impossible odds and somehow found ways to protect what mattered most. Some battles were worth any sacrifice, and this was undoubtedly such a battle. The railroad conspiracy was about to discover that mountain men who'd learned warfare in the service of their country could apply those same skills in defense of their families, with results that would echo through territorial politics for years to come. The new family portrait sat in its place of honor on the mantelpiece, the photographer's careful composition capturing not just 4 faces, but the renewal of hope that had seemed impossible just months before. Obadiah stood, with his hand on Vernon's shoulder, while the twins flanked them on either side, all 4 wearing expressions of quiet contentment that spoke of battles won and family bonds restored. The formal pose couldn't quite contain the warmth that radiated from the group. These were people who'd found each other against impossible odds and chosen to build something lasting from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The confrontation at the cabin had ended, not with violence, but with the arrival of federal marshals, led by Marcus Flynn himself. Armed with warrants based on the evidence Vernon and Obadiah had managed to smuggle out through their network of allied families. Grayson and his men had found themselves facing not helpless victims, but the full weight of federal authority, backed by documentation that exposed the railroad conspiracy in devastating detail. Commissioner Blackthorne's arrest in Denver had made headlines across the territory, his carefully constructed empire of corruption crumbling as witnesses stepped forward to testify about years of systematic persecution. Judge Morrison had fled to Mexico ahead of his own indictment, while Sheriff Caldwell had negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for testimony that implicated railroad officials as far away as Washington. The twins had watched these developments with the serious attention of children who understood that adult victories meant their own safety and security. They'd grown taller and stronger during their months in the mountain cabin, their faces filling out as regular meals and stable shelter worked their healing magic. But more than physical recovery, they'd gained something precious and irreplaceable, the confidence that came from knowing they belonged somewhere, that family bonds could provide protection against whatever challenges the future might bring. Uncle Obadiah? Charity approached his chair by the fireplace, carrying a new sketch that showed the cabin surrounded by gardens and outbuildings that existed only in her imagination. "Do you think we could really build all this someday?" The drawing depicted his hermit refuge, transformed into a proper family homestead, complete with expanded living space, workshop areas, and the kind of domestic details that spoke of permanence and prosperity. It was a child's vision of home, but one grounded in understanding of what families needed to thrive in mountain country. "I think we can build whatever we set our minds to," Obadiah replied, studying the sketch with the seriousness it deserved. "But it'll take time and work from everyone. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" Charity nodded with the solemn determination that characterized both twins when they encountered important decisions. "Patience and I talked about it. We want to stay here with you and Papa forever, if that's all right. This feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has." The sentiment was shared by Vernon, who'd discovered that mountain life suited him far better than the farming existence he'd lost to railroad persecution. His knowledge of crops and animal husbandry complemented Obadiah's wilderness skills perfectly, creating possibilities for expansion that could support a growing family while maintaining the security that isolation provided. The Morrison place is for sale, Vernon mentioned during one of their evening planning sessions. Timothy's decided to move closer to his daughter in Colorado Springs, says he'd be willing to sell to us for a fair price. Combined with our land, we'd have enough range to support cattle and maybe some mining operations. The prospect of legitimate prosperity felt strange to Obadiah after so many years of simple survival, but he was learning to adjust his expectations to accommodate family needs that went beyond his own minimal requirements. The twins deserved opportunities for education and social connection that his hermit existence couldn't provide, even if those opportunities required compromises with the outside world he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Patience had become the family's unofficial treasurer, keeping careful track of expenses and income with the methodical precision that characterized her approach to everything important. The reward money from Blackthorn's conviction, combined with restitution payments from the railroad company, had provided enough capital to consider expansion plans that seemed impossibly ambitious just months earlier. "We could build a school," she suggested during one of their planning discussions. "Other families in the valley would probably send their children if we had a proper teacher and supplies. Charity could teach art, and you could teach practical skills like hunting and wilderness survival." The idea of their isolated cabin becoming a community center was both appealing and terrifying to Obadiah, who'd grown comfortable with solitude, but was learning to appreciate the benefits of human connection. The compromise between hermit security and family responsibility was finding expression in plans that could accommodate both needs. As autumn settled over the mountains with its spectacular display of changing colors, Obadiah found himself standing once more beside the wooden cross that marked his first family's grave. But now, the weekly visits carried different emotions, less raw grief and more peaceful remembrance, the kind of healing that came from understanding that love could survive loss and grow stronger through sharing. "I think they would have liked the twins," he said aloud, speaking to Margaret and Ruth as if they could hear him across the years. "And they would have been proud to see their family growing instead of just surviving." The mountain wind rustled through the pine boughs he'd placed on the grave, carrying the sound of children's laughter from the cabin below where Patience and Charity were helping Vernon prepare the evening meal. It was a sound that had been missing from these heights for too long, but one that seemed to belong here as naturally as the whisper of wind through high branches. Walking back toward the warm glow of lamplight that marked his home, Obadiah reflected on the strange workings of fate that had brought his family together through tragedy, but sustained them through love. The hermit who'd thought himself condemned to permanent isolation had discovered that some bonds were stronger than grief, and that family could be both lost and found in ways that defied all reasonable expectation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new decisions about expansion and education, and the delicate balance between security and growth. But tonight there would be family dinner and quiet conversation, the comfortable routines of people who'd chosen to build something lasting together. The mountain man had come home,